Show you a map of it. Oh yeah, we'll watch it. So. Whenever you want. All right, let's do that.
Can I have everybody's attention, please? Thank you for taking time out of your evening to come up here and learn more about the Dakota Aquifer, which Eastern Seward County sits on. And my name is Scott McCarrick. I'm the District 4 Commissioner for Seward County. And previous planning... Jack, no. Previous planning and zoning board member as well. So tonight, basically what we're going to do is we're going to listen to a couple of geologists, and I'll introduce them in a second. A couple of geologists talk about the information pertaining to the Dakota Aquifer. And before I do that, I've got Jacob Jennings up here. He wants to say a little bit for Seward County. Help me out.
Chamber Development Partnership.
Development Partnership. Go ahead.
Hi everyone. My name is Jacob Jennings. I work for the Seward County Chamber Development Partnership. Want to take a couple minutes here before we get going while we have a captive audience. Really our goal as an organization is to promote Seward County and make sure we continue to thrive and grow. Some communities in Nebraska are doing a better job of that than others. We've got those maybe along the I-80 corridor or around Omaha or Lincoln that are really exploding in population, and that's great for them. That also comes with some problems keeping up with amenities and infrastructure. And then you have others in western Nebraska that are struggling quite a bit. And in Seward County, we want to be somewhere in between. We want to grow, but do it pretty reasonably and intentionally and strategically. And really there's no way around doing that if you don't have jobs and if you don't have housing. So those are two focus areas for us as an organization. I want to talk very briefly about some housing programs that I was not aware of as much as I should be, and I think most probably aren't aware of as much as they should be. And so let me touch on these really quickly. These range from down payment assistance programs to programs that would be better for home builders or developers, rehab projects. There's a fairly wide range. We really need housing in all shapes and sizes. Seward County is not unique. There's a lack of housing, affordable housing throughout Nebraska and throughout the country. So again, we're not unique. I've been living in the same apartment for 5 years now in Seward, and I'd love to get a house, but it's expensive. So these sorts of programs are programs that can help. So I'll just touch on these really quickly. Again, my name is Jacob with the Chamber. Please call the Chamber of Commerce. I didn't bring business cards because I ran out, but you can call the Chamber of Commerce and talk to myself or any one of my teammates, and we could talk through these programs. Good for homeowners, good for renters, or good for municipalities as well. So the first in this packet, which I put by the cookies on purpose, is a home ownership opportunity program. This is a down payment assistance program. Offers up to $25,000. It's essentially a zero-interest loan that gets paid back through the sale of your home. But this is open for anyone as long as you meet some income limits. Luckily with this program, those income limits are pretty generous. So if you're a one-person household, it's less than $80,000, and it goes up the more people you have in your household. So please read up on this. I'm happy to answer any questions. Probably afterwards would be best, but again, you could also call me. Another program is our rural workforce housing funds. These are for home buyers, home builders, developers, whether you're building new or rehabbing. We just had a woman in Seward take advantage of a low-interest loan that we have to rehab a home that was previously vacant and turn it into 3 apartment units that are going to be used by Concordia students. And so that's turning into income for her and turning what was an unused property into something that's really benefiting Seward and Seward County. I'm happy to talk about this program as well. I and my boss Jonathan are the ones that administer this, so You're going to have great communication, and really you can just text me if there's any questions about this one specifically. If we zoom out, while these are more local programs, this third one in the packet is a program through USDA. This one is a single-family housing repair loan and grant. This one is intended more for very low-income folks or senior folks. I don't know as much about this one. It was sent to me by one of the many partners we have across the state that are working on housing. Southeast Nebraska Development District, Nebraska Investment Finance Authority. A lot of us are trying to work on this problem. And then lastly is a story from last year. There's old school buildings like this in Cass County, here in Garland, in Staplers, in Seward, in Utica. Really, we have to start getting creative about what we're doing with our buildings, turning something that's not used right now into apartments or something. That's sort of the mindset we're trying to cultivate in Seward County to try to tackle this problem. So that's just a brief intro on a couple of these programs. There's more out there. We have some resources on our website. Again, several partners across the state that are working on this issue as well, but I would love to develop more housing in Garland in a very reasonable, intentional way. We're not trying to make Garland into a Milford or Garland into a Seward or Lincoln or something, but really every community needs more housing, needs young people to replace the natural population loss through people passing away or moving away, and we're not going to get young families here without housing. So happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Scott, for letting me talk for a minute.
Thank you, Jake. So, most of you know that housing is a big issue, not only in the small communities in Seward County, but in Seward and Milford. You know, people are looking for housing and they just can't find it. So keep that in mind when you're talking to other people. Check out what they have and see if we can move that forward. So in respect for everybody's time tonight, I want to get everybody out of here at 8 o'clock. I think we should be able to do that. Okay? All right. So what we're going to talk about tonight is the Dakota Aquifer, and as our two geologists here, we have Dick Ehrman from Lower Platte South and Katie Cameron from UNL. And I'm going to turn it over to you guys to, if you have questions,
Yeah. Well, thanks, Scott, and I'm glad to be here. As I said, my name's Dick Ehrman. I'm the Water Resources Coordinator for Lower Platte South Natural Resources District, and we're headquartered in Lincoln. For those of you who may not be familiar with the NRD system, there's 23 of them across the state of Nebraska, divided up on the basis of watershed boundaries, which is kind of an interesting arrangement for political subdivisions. Our district goes from just about here in eastern Seward County, Garland, Pleasantdale, that area, all the way over to Missouri, around Plattsmouth, Union, and up to the north, about to Brainerd, down to the south, about Hallam and Hickman. So that's kind of the area that we cover. What we're going to do tonight, and Scott said, yeah, he wants us to get out of here in an hour, but you got to be careful, Scott. You know, we're a couple geologists. To us, a million years is a short time. You know, so you get us going on rocks, we could be here all night. But no, we'll get through the information fairly quickly, and then you know, stay around as long as people want to have questions. So with that, I'm going to give just a little bit of background on the history and the geology of the Dakota, just very general 30,000 foot view of it. Then Katie is going to get into the recent airborne electromagnetic surveying that we've done over the past several years in our district and throughout eastern Nebraska. And then we'll finish off with a little bit about some of the concerns that we've heard about at the NRD office and what some of the future steps might be that involve us. So that's kind of the plan for tonight. Okay, Katie, am I doing this right? Oh, there we go. Okay. So the Dakota Aquifer, as you know, it underlies this part of the world here. Got to do a little bit of geology. The Dakota is a complex series of sediments and sedimentary rocks. Typically stuff like sand, sandstone, and shale, and some other things thrown in there, but that's mainly what the Dakota is. The Dakota was deposited somewhere around 100 million years ago, give or take a few tens of millions of years, That's the early Cretaceous period, if you like that sort of stuff. The later part of the age of the dinosaurs. So the dinosaurs were kind of on their way out, well, within about 30 million years or so. At this time, Nebraska, eastern Nebraska particularly, was a lot different than it is right now. It was part of what was called the Western Interior Seaway. For a long time, geologists have known that at this part in Earth's history, the sea levels were high enough that the ocean came up right through the middle of North America and kept most of Nebraska underwater for a variety of time periods. You can see here's Nebraska right here. Eastern Nebraska would be right on the shoreline of that particular interior seaway. And if you think of a beach environment, a swamp environment, a nearshore environment, if you can imagine ocean levels going up and down over time, the sediments deposited by those oceans would vary quite a bit. You get deeper water, you get finer grained sediments like silt and clay. Shallower water, maybe even a beach environment, you get stuff like sand. So the result is the Dakota in this part of the world is just insanely complicated. It's just a mishmash of a lot of different kinds of rocks and sediments. And that accounts for the variability not only of the geology, but of the groundwater units as well. I'm sure many of you know that in some cases, people have drilled a well in one place, got plenty of water, go a half mile down the road, got hardly anything, okay? And that's because of the variability of the rocks and sediments that make up the Dakota, okay? All right, see if we can get this thing to go here.
It might be a distance thing.
Is
I
that
don't
too
know.
far away? Okay, maybe I'm on the wrong side here. I'm always on the wrong side if you ask my wife, so. Okay, so this is a bedrock map of eastern Nebraska. And basically everything you see in this kind of light olive green here, that is where the Dakota, what we call it, it's the uppermost bedrock. Now this doesn't mean that the only place that the Dakota occurs is in this part of eastern Nebraska. It's just where this area outlined by this kind of bright blue or bright aqua, that's the area where the Dakota is the first bedrock. The Dakota is a big, big unit. It goes all the way from somewhere up in the Dakotas down further south into Kansas, and then it dives down into the subsurface and comes up in western Nebraska, Colorado, those sorts of places. So it's a really, really big regional bedrock unit. But here's where it is in eastern Nebraska. And here's about where we are right now with that red dot there here in Garland. So you can kind of get an idea of where the Dakota is most prominent in eastern Nebraska. And again, because as you get further west here, you get into areas where they have the Ogallala or High Plains Aquifer. And you've all probably heard of that. That's an area where there's generally lots of water. It's a world-class aquifer. Unfortunately, due to the actions of glaciers and other geologic processes, we kind of got rooked here in eastern Nebraska. The glaciers took away a lot of that good aquifer material, and we're left with stuff like the Dakota sandstone, other smaller aquifer units. So that, again, the geology, the geologic history of eastern Nebraska kind of explains why the groundwater resources are so variable in eastern Nebraska. These are some actual cores from some test holes that Katie and people from the University of Nebraska drilled. And are these right by here by Garland, Katie?
By Branch Oak and Garland
Okay,
area.
so yeah, they're in this general area. And again, if you want to see these in a little more detail, you come up afterwards. But basically, you can get a feel for what those rocks look like. It's kind of hard to see, but they are pretty variable. Here's one that has a fossil leaf in it. So again, an indication that these sediments and rocks were deposited in kind of maybe a swampy environment or something like that. Oh, and again, I want to keep this pretty informal, so if there's something you don't understand or if you have a question as I'm going along, just go ahead and shoot your hand up and I'll try to answer it while you're thinking of it. Okay, a little bit about the groundwater here. This map I like because it illustrates a little bit of some of the things that you folks are up against, and y'all know what's going on here. This is a map from Seward County, and again, it's just, this is a zoning map, and these different colors represent different zoning statuses and I'm certainly no expert on that, but of course here's Seward, here's Garland, here's Pleasantdale. But the one thing I wanted to point out is this brown crosshatched area. That's Seward's, is it Special Water Management District, Scott, is that?
Water Conservation District.
Conservation District. For some reason, I can't remember that name, okay? This map over here is a map of all of the registered water wells in the Lower Platte South NRD's portion of Seward County. Now, if you compare these two maps, okay, this red area is the portion of Seward County that resides within my district. The Water Management District goes just a little bit further to the east, or excuse me, the west, something like this. And that's in the Upper Big Blue Natural Resources District, which is headquartered out of York. Lucky to have a couple of folks, Marie and Terry from Upper Big Blue, come in here to, to see what we have to present. But if you have questions about this area there, they can probably help you out as well. What I like about this map is if you look at the area within the red here, that again shows the number of registered water wells within Seward County within the Lower Platte South NRD. If you break them out by types, domestic wells are by far the largest number of wells within this area. Those are represented by the blue triangles. Within this area, as of, I dumped this data a few days ago, so it's pretty current. 350, or about 350 domestic wells. These pink dots that you see here, those are ground source heat pump wells. Those really, in most cases, don't have a lot to do with groundwater because typically they're just circulating some sort of fluid around in a loop to use for the thermal properties of the earth. But again, that just gives you an idea of where those are at. Here's probably the thing that illustrates some of what we're up against most. In this whole area here, there are only 4 irrigation wells. Irrigation wells, as you probably most all know, generally require a pretty good output, anywhere from 200 maybe up to 1,000 gallons per minute. So basically, in this whole area, as long as this area's been inhabited, people have drilled a lot of test holes and looked for water for a lot of years for irrigation. Haven't found it. And again, it gets back to the nature of the Dakota and some of the other settlements that are unable to supply that amount of water. Yes?
Just to clarify, so an irrigation well is just defined by how fast it pumps?
Not necessarily. It's defined more by what it's used for
Okay.
to irrigate crops or something like that. But again, in the Cornhusker state, most irrigation wells are used to irrigate corn or soybeans or something like that. And if you got a standard center pit up that irrigates a quarter section, 136 acres, something like that, most of those wells do require a few to several hundred gallons per minute. Okay?
Okay.
And again, one of the things, getting back to the definitions, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but these blue triangles, the domestic wells, under state classification and in some cases state statute, these are defined as wells that are used for domestic purposes, basically drinking water, household supply, but they pump less than 50 gallons per minute, okay? And most of these wells, if you look at the registrations, they're registered as pumping maybe 5 to 20 gallons a minute. So compare that with 200 to 700 gallons a minute necessary for large-scale irrigation. And you can kind of get a sense for the limited nature of the groundwater supply in this part of the world, which again is no surprise probably to anybody in this room. 26 stock wells, other types of wells, commercial, public water supply, there's 11 of those. So. Okay, still on the road?
Question.
Yeah.
So what if you have somebody who wants to have an irrigation well for crops?
Mm-hmm.
And it's, say, a mile away from a domestic well or a group of wells. And what happens if that irrigation well were to cause failure of a domestic well?
That's a good question. We get that question a lot. Number one, in this area, if somebody wanted an irrigation well, the first thing they'd have to do is find adequate water. And again, this illustrates that that's not an easy thing to do. But if somebody were to put in a larger capacity well at a certain distance from a domestic well, and currently right now in our district, we've got a minimum 600-foot spacing between those types of wells. And it doesn't sound like much, but that's what we've got in our regulations. If you think a well is causing interference with your well and it's causing problems with that, basically how that has worked in Nebraska over the years is that somebody who thinks that their well's being interfered with, basically they seek legal redress for that. There haven't been very many lawsuits in Nebraska because it's expensive to do that. The few that I'm aware of, and I think Jack, you might be as familiar with this as I am, but the few that I'm aware of, one particularly, when the plaintiff was able to prove in court to the court's satisfaction that that well was interfering with his domestic well, basically the owner of the larger well just had to pay to have the other guy's well deepened and refitted. So again, it's kind of a messy situation, but that's how Nebraska state law typically works.
But in the Dakota Aquifer, you can't go deeper, you get salt water.
That is correct. That is correct.
So what then?
Well, again, like I say, if you can't find a lot of water here, you're not going to develop it for irrigation.
What if you do? And there's some people that will several small wells to get enough water to irrigate crops.
Again, like I say, just looking at this, there just aren't that many irrigation wells or wells that pump enough water for irrigation of corn and soybeans. Historically in Nebraska, if there is water available, irrigation has been developed. This is one of those areas where, a lot of exploration hasn't resulted in much yield for hundreds of gallons a minute. I know it.
The RD won't step in and say, this shouldn't be irrigated.
What we do is if they're pumping more than 50 gallons a minute, we then permit those wells. They have to go through our permitting process. If they're under 50 gallons a minute and used for domestic purposes, by state statute, and I'll get into that a little bit later, those are exempt from our permit, okay? That's the law, that's state statute. So if somebody does come in and wants to put in a well that is more than 50 gallons a minute, we take a look at the geology. Under some certain circumstances, we can require that well permit application to do some aquifer testing to demonstrate that it won't have negative impacts on pre-existing wells. But again, that kind of depends on the situation.
It's a one-time deal. If they cause damage to my well, and it's irreversible, what the hell do you do then?
Again, right now, the recourse is through the legal system. So, and I know that's not what you want to hear, but that's how the state law in Nebraska has worked out, particularly when you're talking about smaller scale wells. Yeah, I hear you.
So what happens if you punch through the salt water layer and it comes up and poisons the wells around it? Who's responsible for that?
It again would be a situation where if somebody goes down and gets down into that salt water, number one, they're probably not going to be using that water. I mean, what can you use salt water for?
Yeah, but it can come up through the stem.
Correct. So basically what would have to be done there is would have to see, if that's where that saltwater intrusion is coming from. Now again, working with the well drillers in this part of the region, they're aware of those salt conditions, okay? And typically they won't drill to a depth that really increases your risk about that. Now I don't want to speak for every well driller, but knowing most of the well drillers in this part of the world, they're aware of that situation.
That's where you get in trouble, where you get other well drillers coming in from different parts of the state to come in here and drill that aren't familiar with it.
Yep.
Did I hear you correctly, Will? You said 600 feet on new wells, that have to be distance-wise?
How our regulations work, Mark, is that if you have a pre-existing well with a higher preference of use, state statute sets out preference of use. Domestic drinking water is the highest preference, agriculture is second, commercial is third. So if you are putting in a new well that is of lower preference of use, you have to be at least 600 foot away from that place. Yeah.
How do I know if my well is registered or was registered or needs to be registered.
The State Department of Natural Resources maintains a water well registration database. Since about 1993, Jack, correct me if that's the wrong date.
I was thinking 91, but you're close.
It's the early 90s, about 93. Every well drilled in the state of Nebraska has to be registered with DNR. If your well was drilled before that, particularly if it's a small capacity well, it may or may not be registered. So basically, and we can talk about this afterwards if you want, if you can give me your location and your name, I can look that up in that database, or I can show you how to do it. And you can go into that. If it doesn't show up in the database, then it's not registered. So,
I was gonna say that the database is accessible on the website, and
Correct.
you can go in and look.
yeah, it's publicly accessible.
Now, what department is that again?
That's the Department of Natural Resources. A little bit confusing because I'm with the Natural Resources District, but the State Department of Natural Resources maintains that database. And again, I can show you that.
Natural Resources Water Well Registration Program.
That's it. Mhm.
And I've gone to that website,
Okay.
and less than half in this area are registered.
And probably one of the main reasons for that is that many of these wells will predate that 1993.
Oh, yeah.
They weren't required to be registered before that, if they're a little smaller capacity.
Approve an irrigation well
Mhm.
based on the number of wells, domestic wells in the
Mhm.
area, and you're a half, you're 50% off,
Mhm.
you're kind of shooting us in the foot.
That's why we always recommend that if you have a well that's not registered, that you get it registered, because that gives you at least that minimal protection of knowing where it's at. If a well's not registered, you know, it's kind of hard for us to know that it's out there. So, yeah.
I just have a question on the previous slide of where the Dakota Aquifer is.
Mhm.
That looks to me like it all, am I incorrect, is that all of Lancaster County?
It's most except for the southeast part,
And
kind of cuts
about
across this way.
88% of Seward County, and then it goes all the way over to York.
Yeah, you
correct?
know, the area there, yeah, you can figure that out. It looks to me like, yeah, 3/4-ish, something like that.
And everything
But
west
again-
of Seward is all irrigated
But-
cropland.
Yeah, but again, keep in mind, this is the uppermost bedrock, okay? As you get further west, younger bedrock units overlay the Dakota. And as you get about where you see the yellow here, that's the Ogallala. Here in Seward County, just in the very, you know, do we have any?
So the Ogallala is in connection with younger sediments that are continuous all the way across into Seward County.
Yeah. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, the Seward papers said before the western half of Seward County is in the Ogallala and they have plenty of water, and that's why
Yes.
we have this tiny little spring
Yes.
here,
Mhm.
over here, but it looks like honestly the Dakota's all the way over to York.
And the Dakota is diving in depth,
Right.
deeper, deeper, deeper as you go to
You
the
know,
west and getting salty.
Roughly, yeah, the eastern quarter, third of Seward County doesn't have the Ogallala.
I'm not sure the exact percentage, but it's in that general neck of the woods.
And Lancaster County is having no concerns about water.
Oh, I wouldn't say that. So, but again, the geology of parts of Lancaster County is quite different. There are certain aquifer units in certain parts of Lancaster County that are quite productive, but again, it's highly variable, just because of the geology. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie. She's going to talk to you about the air. Oh, I'm sorry. Question back there?
A lot of the reason you got to blame is your county board, because there is a regulation in your county, 2004, between quarter sections, and they go to zoning meetings all the time, and they change it to let people bid.
I guess I can't address that because the NRD doesn't have any zoning authority. So I know that sounds like kind of a lame answer, but it's the truth. So,
Is there a cost to register your well?
yeah, the cost is, I can't remember exactly, it's either $75 or $85. One-time cost.
It's
Yeah.
$70.
70.
You ask all kinds of questions like, what is your static well level? What
Mhm.
is your well
Mhm.
depth? My well has been there before I lived there, and they say those are required in order to register it. So
That's, I guess I would say that that's not always the case. I have helped people register wells, and yeah, wells that are quite old. They don't have any idea how deep the water table is. They don't maybe not even have any idea how deep the well itself is. So we always encourage them to go ahead and register the well, put as much information as you know on there. The big thing is have the location of the well. Know where the well is located. Most cell phones now have a GPS on it that you can put on there, and that's the most important. I wouldn't say it's the only important thing, but if that's all you've got is you've got your name and address and the location of the well, you can estimate the depth of it. You know, your well driller might know, somebody else might know. Put down as much information as you can, and typically DNR will go ahead and register. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Katie. She's going to talk about the airborne electromagnetic survey.
Okay. So I'm with the State Geological Survey Conservation Survey Division, CSD is what we call it. And then as part of that, part of my position is coordinating for the Eastern Nebraska Water Resources Assessment Project, which the Lower Platte South is part of the 6 easternmost NRDs in the state, who got together in 2006 to assess the hydrogeology together to pool their resources. And we started using this airborne electromagnetic survey, or AEM survey technology, back by near Ashland in 2006. And it's advanced over time. And pretty much by 2018, does anybody remember seeing the helicopter with the hoop hanging, flying over? Yeah, in 2018, the Lower Platte South, combined with the other 5 districts, and did a large assessment of the whole eastern Nebraska region together on a water sustainability project. And now we're up to about 24,000 line miles of flights in eastern Nebraska. So I'm not going into the geophysics to save time. We're not going to talk technical geophysics, but the key with it is you can get a lot of ground covered in a short amount of time. We have a lot of borehole information. So we have detailed logs from our State Geological Survey test holes. We have the registered well database that has driller's logs in it. Those are point data on a map. Now we can fly a flight line and get a picture between. And so you go like 50 miles an hour, that hoop's hanging there, there's a generator hanging halfway, there's a wire doing a bunch of turns in that loop, and the power's getting turned on and off. So what you're ending up with is these virtual boreholes, we call them, of information below ground. And what it's doing is picking up the electrical contrast in the layered earth materials. So just a slide about that, and we're going to talk through this a little bit, but we're not getting too much into it. Why it works is our aquifer materials show up one way, and our non-aquifer materials generally show up a completely different way, that contrast we're talking about. So imagine if you had a car battery and a jumper cable, and you hooked it up to a block of wood. That would be very resistive. It wouldn't allow the current to go through very good. That's more like your aquifer, your materials, or your coarse sediments, like your sands and gravels, where the pore spaces, you can extract a lot of water out of those. Also sandstones, and important to note, the limestones also show up that way too. Even though you have to have a fractured limestone basically to get a well in it. And around in this area, nobody's really getting water mainly out of limestone at all. So, and then the cool colors, the low resistivity values. Imagine you took those same jumper cables, put them up to a copper wire. Allows the current to go right through. They're more low resistivity values. That would be your shales, your clays, your non-aquifer sediments. The only time this doesn't really work is if you have the saline groundwater in the sandstone. So you have the coarse material, you have the pore spaces, you have the saline groundwater in there, and it's more conductive, so it's very low resistivity value. So it'll show up as a non-aquifer. It's hard to tell if it's a shale or if it's salt water in the sandstone. But at least you know it's not an aquifer. Oh, it did. It was just delayed. Okay, so this is the same concept up at the top as the color scale. Remember, low values, non-aquifer materials, coarser sediments, brighter colors. In up to 2018, when this survey was done on the eastern part of Seward County, we have covered, and I'll get to a map in a minute. We had a lot of state geological survey test holes that we tried to fly lines along so that we were able to ground truth what we're seeing with the technology. And so that's just kind of a diagram on the right-hand side that's showing the actual borehole. The little black rectangle is where the screen interval is in the sand, which is a yellow. And just to give you an example of what we have to the points that we plot with the airborne data. But after running through all that, we also have downhole geophysics from oil and gas exploration holes and from our state geological test holes that we've done since the 1960s. We've done E-logs, we call them E-logs. It's the same picking up the electrical contrast, but it's down the borehole. So we send a tool down there and we're getting detailed information at that location. So we have all that to put together to kind of where we got to. Non-aquifer, got everything above bedrock. Non-aquifer is this blue color. Marginal would be the tan when we're looking at the results on the next few pages. Aquifer material will show up yellow, and coarse aquifer is going to be your brown. So you could get like an irrigation well for sure in the brown, if you're going to get that. The yellow, maybe, you definitely will get a house well. Marginal, might get a house well. Blue, you're probably not going to get anything. Maybe if you're lucky, you could get one house well if you hit that right vein. This is just what I'm generalizing from what we've learned over the years with doing all these surveys.
Okay,
And then,
so stupid question.
Okay.
So all of this is telling you the depth of the water, the amount of the water,
No,
or
it's
the
telling you
accessibility, or
the
what?
contrast. So we'll get to examples below ground. We'll start thinking below ground next on the next few slides.
Okay.
But what's seeing is the contrast between the aquifer material and the non-aquifer.
So just where the aquifer is.
Where it is, yes, and
Okay.
what might be above it versus below it, how they might be potentially connected or not connected to each other.
Okay.
Yep. And so the bedrock is shown for Dakota. They've committed it to two categories, either shale clay dominant or saline dominant versus your sand or sandstone dominant. And because around here, you know, Dick mentioned that, you know, the Dakota, you're getting maybe down at 400 feet is where the house wells are. By the time you're down at 400 feet with this technology, you're lumping the information into 40-foot buckets. So that first layer of information is about 3 feet. The resolution is getting poorer with depth. So by the time you're at 400 feet, it's a bucket of 40-foot information. But you have the test holes or the logs to match everything up with to make it. There we go. So this is a map of the airborne survey. The purple are the 2018 surveys. So you can see how they cover Seward. The town of Seward is right here. Let's see. There's Branched Oak, Pawnee. Yeah, Garland's right there. So you can see the coverage of the lines. Now the tighter you fly and the more boreholes you have, you can make a three-dimensional volume of the aquifer and guess how much volume you have when you get them closer together. So when we planned this, it was all planned based on kind of what we knew ahead of time and tried to get edges of different units and things like that. So on the right-hand side is the same map, except for we have that first geologic bedrock map that Dick showed earlier for the Dakota. So the Dakota will be the color of this like light army green color, and then Greenhorn Graneros is 1 unit younger. So he mentioned 100 million year old Dakota. That one would be like, there's 2 different units there, a limestone and a shale, maybe 93 million. But what you can see here is there's like, that would be higher because it'd be younger, so it'd be on top. And something eroded through here, and it's Dakota as first bedrock here, but then we've got that Greenhorn Graneros again down to the south. So what we're going to do is look at number 1 from west to east first. So that's a flight line flowing from west to east. Then we're going to look at a north-south right along the county line, Lancaster-Seward. And then we'll look at our westernmost line here, the furthest west, which would be like this line right here. And the red dots are test holes that we did after the AEM flight. So we wanted to ground truth even more after we flew. We might have had questions. So Okay, so this is the west to east. This top track map is a topographic map. This is the county line, Lancaster over here, there's Branched Oak. This is Seward County. This is the flight line. So what you would do is go straight down, and we have elevation in feet above sea level as the left-hand side. And this is the data profile. So this is the resistivity I talked about, the blocks of wood versus the copper wires. You can see the cooler colors are the very low resistivities. The brighter colors would be the more resistive sediments, your aquifer materials. This is a test hole that we did for the Lower Platte South in conjunction with the CSD, so it was a state geological test hole. What I want to point out is this is the log of that test hole. We went down to 640 feet. We wanted to get all the way through the Dakota because we knew that greenhorn graneros was up top, so we get that fresh top contrast, so we get the top of the Dakota all the way down to the bottom to the older sediments, which are 300 million years old. There's a gap there. But you can see the variability of it over here on the right. That's a summary of that 640 feet of information of siltstones, claystones, sandstones, and there's a large area that has sandstones deep, okay? But what I want to point out is on the AEM, remember we said if it's got the salt water in the pore spaces, it's going to show up very low. That would correspond to this right here, and we can look more into that later. But I have a question mark here. We just don't know without samples and screen and sampling it to know for sure if that is salt water. We think it is based on everything that we have. Okay. This is the one along Lancaster County, Seward County line. South is what geologists always put north on the left, but geophysicists put south on the left, so we have to rethink ourselves. But this is the south end of the line, and this is the north end of the line, and it's all along the county line here. So that Branched Oak would be here, Pawnee would be here, Pleasantville would be right here, and we're looking at this red line, and if you look straight down, on the south end of this line, there's not much aquifer material interpreted whatsoever. So I didn't mention that on the previous line, but this is the interpretation after we're talking about the data. This is what they came up with. So they say that the older bedrock is higher. They also say that there's no sandstone dominant. They also say there's a lot of clay up top, maybe a couple little marginals in here on the south end. But when you get to Pleasantville, you can see there's a large resistor there, a bright color. They're interpreting it as sandstone dominant. And we zoom into that. We have a data program with the Nebraska GeoCloud. They took all the registered wells up to 2019 and summarized them into these categories of clay, sand, sandstone, uniform categories. So we could plot them up in our programs and see it in 3D with the data sets we have. So this is the zoom in of this area, and we changed the scale a little because the salt water we're finding is showing a very, very low resistivity. So it's black on this color scale. This is a 0 to 60. The report had a little bit different 10 to 60 color scale. But you can see that I have a question mark here. We don't know. If it appears that might be saline, right? That would be right here. So potentially, and along Lancaster County, we know we have saline in the Dakota. So it all points to that. And then this is the westernmost AEM line. So this is that north-south line. Here's Milford. This is that topographic map. Here's the county line to the north. And so Garland would be like kind of right here, I think, on this line. And then we took this and zoomed in to over here to look at those registered well logs. And there is a mismatch. We are seeing bright colors that are interpreted as aquifer material that potentially might not be aquifer material. They do match up with the screen intervals for the big, bright resistors where there's sandstone. But you see here we have clay and a brighter color. So we know there's something with the when we did a test hole near the town of Garland, we did find that there's calcareous or calcium carbonate in the clay. And that, if you remember from that first slide with the limestone, will show up as a bright, coarse material. So that could be adding to why we're seeing brighter colors. But we definitely, what I want to bring home is just we still have questions. So like Dick mentioned with the complexity of the Dakota, We also have the complexity of what happened after and all the gaps in time, and the glaciers coming and advancing like a bulldozer and leaving a variety of materials in no particular order after the fact. A lot of questions without additional ground truth information. So just a little bit more on the drilling that CSD does. This is just a picture of a drilling rig. This is what we do for our state test holes. We have a person at the table that's logging samples, and then one person's catching the samples. This is similar to people drilling wells. You know, they have a similar setup here too. But since 2006, when the NWR group started, this is how many new test holes have been drilled in our eastern Nebraska area. So a lot of newer stuff. We're kind of putting all this picture together of the AEM. And this is the downhole geophysics log that I mentioned that is a similar technology as the airborne, only this is down the hole. So the resistivity curves, just like we were looking on a scale of 0 to 100, would be here. And what I want to point out with this one in southeastern Seward County is we had very fine non-cemented sandstone. So it's showing up as a resistive, a bright color on those other images. Then we went to a fine to medium non-cemented sandstone, which should have showed up brighter or higher resistivity values. And all of a sudden, boom, it went down to almost nothing resistivity. Why? Because we think that was the saline groundwater. That's the line. It's at a depth of 450 in this hole, in this location. This is just a shale line over here to help us, so we know, based on this, it wasn't shale. We know it was likely the saline groundwater. So putting all the flight lines together, okay, this is all the flight lines that were done for Lower Platte South in 2018. They're the profiles of just both bedrock and below, and then the red is what they were estimating just based on this initial 2018 survey of where that saltwater potential was in Dakota. That's what the red you see under here. So this would be Pleasantdale here. This is the county outline here. And you can see there is some sandstone available. They've exaggerated it. It's not really that thick. But just so you can get a visual idea of the coverage for the whole area. Now, I'll just real quick talk about recharge, because it's a really important thing that we've been focusing on next, because how old is this water? When's the last time that it was replenished? Are we using it up? In the AEM reports they did produce for those top few layers, was it coarse? Was it marginal? Was it non-aquifer? That's what this image is, the same image as this, only just looking at that top 10 feet. So you can see there's a lot of clay near the surface. There are some that showed maybe there was some sand near the surface, but that was just the top 10 feet, and out here that might not mean a lot for the aquifer. So we did another water sustainability project as a group for eastern Nebraska. This is the county line on this map for Seward County or Seward. High, moderate, and low is we worked with USGS. They did statistical analysis on all the AEM data, and we used the boreholes and quality information. It came up with these high, moderate, and low to help guide us to the next step of figuring out the recharge. And as you can see, and generally speaking, it was mainly the moderate and low. So it's not coming straight down, likely, maybe, and we just don't know without more assessment. At least we have a guide now. By Lincoln you can see high. Well, that's because the sandstone is near the surface and it's easily replenished. And then on the right, these little dots here, we did do some age dating with USGS back in 2016. 2 Dakota samples, so one was 162 feet deep, one was 212 feet deep. That was just over into Lancaster County. And one showed pre-modern based on tritium dating, so like the atomic bombs that went off in the upper atmosphere. When you do a sample, you can trace that back and see if it was before that happened or after with the groundwater. So they were saying before 1950 possibly in the one hole, but then right across the county line they had another one where they used carbon-14, and it was modern, I think it was like 39 years or something. But the stable isotopes were very similar. So we still have more questions to go on the recharge question. And does anybody have a question? I know that was a lot, and I tried to go quick to beat the 8 o'clock, and I don't think I did it, but.
No, we're okay. Okay, we'll just finish off with some of the groundwater concerns, and I don't think any of this will be a surprise to anybody in the room, but after talking to Phil and Scott and some of the other residents out here, here's some things that have come up over the last several years. As I've already said, the Dakota and eastern Seward County generally adequate for domestic supplies. Most domestic wells, as I said, pump 5 to 20 gallons a minute, but in most cases, at least not on a large scale, it's not used for irrigation at hundreds of gallons per minute. As I mentioned earlier, it's important to know that if wells are used for domestic supply, household wells, by state statute, those are exempt from the NRD permitting system. Like I say, they are required to be registered, but we don't issue permits for those wells. Other authorities, and again, you know, you've had these discussions a lot, it sounds like, zoning, other authorities can be employed to manage the development of groundwater. I know that with the setup of the district there, Seward County is at least trying to get out in front of this issue, and there's a lot of other places in the state where that's not happening. So I do have to compliment the county at least trying to address these issues. You know, we're in the middle of a several-year dry period. That's not helping at all, and a big surprise there. These last few rains are certainly welcome, but as far as actually affecting the groundwater levels, probably not going to do too much. Katie mentioned the recharge there, very complicated situation, but much of the recharge to the aquifer there takes decades to centuries, depending upon where you're at. And again, yeah, the recharge is slow and limited. Did just want to mention a little bit about groundwater quality because it's been mentioned. Obviously, the big concern here for your folks is saltwater intrusion or recharge from lower geologic units. Again, you know, if a well's drilled too deep, that's a possible pathway up. But again, you also got to remember if there's just wells that are completed in the fresh water up above and they're pumping hard enough, they can also induce that upward flow as well. So it's a matter not just of well construction, but how much water is being withdrawn, which again is probably not a big surprise to anybody here. One bit of good news, due to the depth of Dakota here and fine-grained units that are up close to the surface, other contaminants from the surface, you hear about nitrate problems in the Platte Valley and other parts of Nebraska. That's typically not an issue in this part of the world because the water is deep and there's fine-grained units overlying the aquifer unit. So nitrate and some of those other surface-induced contaminants typically aren't much of an issue in this part of the world. So, yeah, Mark.
You talked about if you went over 50 gallon a minute, you'd have to register your well.
No, you'd have to have a permit for us.
So
Yeah.
yeah. Would you deny a permit, or what's your permitting process?
Our permitting process is basically we take a look at the information supplied. Okay. The geology, nearby wells, all those sorts of things, the amount of water being pumped. And as I said, we do have the authority to require aquifer testing up front to evaluate drawdown, recovery, zone of influence, that sort of thing. Based upon that, then the board of directors makes the decision whether issuing that permit is in the public interest. I don't want to say that we have hard and fast numbers that, well, if you're here, an inch below will deny it, an inch above will permit it. It's not quite that straightforward, but again, we would present that information to the board of directors and they would decide as to whether or not to issue the permit.
I just wonder, like, if somebody was being crafty and say, all right, I got a quarter. You take one in the center and you go 600 feet and put one in each quadrant on the four corners, so you got 5 wells there that can get maybe 100 gallon a minute on a pipe dream, maybe in this area. There is a potential that it could get a permit.
In that case, if they were doing that and they were hooked together to run a center pivot, say, we take the aggregate volume, okay? So if you had 4 100 gallon per minute wells, we would look at that as a 400 gallon per minute well. And in this part of our district, it's fairly likely that an aquifer testing activity would be required. But again, there's a lot of...
I'm just asking.
I was going to say, in this...
People get crafty and then they start stretching the limit of what they can do.
You see that in Nebraska. Jack can tell you a lot of those stories. You know, it's just, yeah, there are people, you know, they try to work around the regulations. Yeah. But again, like I would say, you know, just the low occurrence of wells more than about 20 gallons per minute in this part of the world, pretty good indicator that, man, you're just probably not going to find that.
Get it for 10 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, that doesn't do you a whole lot of good. Okay, so let's just finish off with some possible future actions. And again, this is just some ideas that Katie and I put down together just for where we go from here. Okay, as Katie mentioned, through the Conservation Survey Division, we can do test hole drilling to gain more information about the nature of the subsurface geology and the amount of water that can be yielded from those sediments and rocks. We are pretty much done with the airborne electromagnetic surveying for now. We may have some limited ground-based geophysics in the future, but that's still on the drawing board. So for right now, that electromagnetic surveying for this part of for our entire district is pretty much done. Based upon that test hole drilling, we do have a program where we install permanent groundwater monitoring wells that we can monitor both the quality and the quantity of the groundwater, measure the water level as it goes up and down, measure the quality of the water for things like salt, nitrate, other things. We do have that program. Based upon that sort of thing, we can do various aquifer testing activities and characterization activities. Again, pumping different wells, observing how water levels decline, observing how fast they recover. You can do some groundwater modeling on that, which can tell you a lot more about the capabilities of the groundwater system. And again, given the variability of the Dakota here, that sort of thing can be very, very useful. Again, additional water quality testing. We take water quality samples for our groundwater network, and it is at least a possibility that we could do some water quality testing in this part of the district. Yeah?
It seems like, just looking through the well logs, it seems like there's a few big center pivot wells in the water conservation district.
Yeah.
One that pumps 800, one that pumps 900 gallons per minute.
Most cars are down by Pleasantdale.
Wouldn't those wells be like a perfect opportunity for doing this kind of testing to see, because they're going to draw down?
Yeah, and we do, we have done that sort of work. Let's see, as long as I've been with the district for about 16 years, we have not done that in any of the wells in Seward County, but it is a possibility. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that. You typically drill monitoring wells outside of the pumping well. You measure the water drawdown in the well and as it recovers, and then measure it in the observation wells, and that gives you better data. So it's not just you go out and make a few measurements and come up with grand conclusion. It takes some time and a fair amount of money to do it. So, and our board, just like any other board, they're watching their expenses. I just do want to say that this sort of stuff is sort of stuff we're doing, but right now we are in our budget proposal and development process for, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
What decides where you do your test hole drilling?
That's in conjunction with Katie and the other geologists at the Conservation Survey Division. We take a look at, those AEM lines, for example. And if she said, as she said, there's an area where she has questions about what exactly is down there and what's the data showing us, that would be a candidate for someplace that we might drill a test hole.
So Garland would be a good candidate?
I'm sorry?
Garland would be a good candidate for that?
We drilled one just what?
On Old Mill Road, yep, just east of town.
Yeah, just east of town.
465.
Yeah. So, and again, those sorts of things, we first looked at where we would like to have the data, but we've got to have land access to do it. So it's got to be a willing landowner to let us on the ground. Yeah, so those are the two big things. Yeah.
Of all the counties that are above the Dakota Aquifer, how many are actually registered as water conservation districts?
None. As far as I know, and again, somebody who is closer to that than I am, as far as I know, Seward County is the only county-level water conservation district in Nebraska. Is that right? And forgive me if I'm wrong, but that's all I'm aware of.
Yep, that's it.
Yeah. So again, Seward County, I know you got a lot of problems, but you are to be complimented on taking that step and trying to get out in front of this thing. Okay, so again, the budget process, we're about to complete our budget for FY26. So I guess
final message here is let's keep this conversation going. Let's talk about what can be done from the NRD and from the university to help you folks out. I'm not here to make any promises. The board's got to approve everything I do. But we could certainly talk about the data that might be necessary, the kinds of data, where it's necessary, that sort of thing. And, you know, some folks can come in and talk to our subcommittee and our board and explain what you're up against, and that generally means a lot to them. They can respond to people who have issues. Yeah.
You mentioned for irrigation wells, you say that they have to stay 600 feet away from.
That's actually a state statute. Any 2 irrigation wells have to be at least 600 foot apart.
What about between domestic wells?
There is no spacing between domestic wells other than some of the construction requirements require them to be, I think it's like 50 feet from a septic tank or a lagoon system. And, you know, generally, of course, you don't want them very close together, but there's no requirement for that.
If you've got 5 or 6 domestic wells within a quarter mile, what do you think the risk is of leading to that?
Oh, I can't say because the situations are far too complicated there. But I can say as a general rule of thumb, as you would guess, the further apart those wells are, the less the chance is for well interference. Typically, when you have a small capacity well, 10 gallon a minute or something, they don't have a huge zone of influence. But again, that depends upon the nature of the aquifer material, how much water is being pumped, that sort of thing.
Shouldn't there be a monitoring? Shouldn't there be a monitoring group that says you shouldn't have 5 wells within a quarter mile?
I guess it depends on what you mean, you know, whether should it be or shouldn't it be. Because for every person who's concerned about having too many wells in a given area, there's another person who thinks that they can put a few more in there. And it's not an easy thing, but we've got to balance those competing interests out.
But you have the information about poor recharging of the aquifer. You have information saying you're depleting it. When do we say no more? When we say back off a little bit?
Again, like I say, as far as domestic wells go, that's outside of the NRD's authority. We just simply can't say, you've got a domestic well that's pumping less than 50 gallon a minute, we have no say over where those wells are located. They just have to be properly constructed and registered with the state. And again, that's state statute. So again, I know that's not what you want to hear, but that's the truth.
To do that, you have these extra wells tapping into the same water that you're using, then you get depleted, the other wells are still going. Is that fair?
Again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a geologist, so I'm not going to say what's fair and what's not. But the trick there is, you know, which wells are actually causing that interference. And it may seem like a simple situation, but it's rarely that simple.
And I don't think you've said anything here tonight that says that the Dakota is being depleted.
I guess I don't have any data in my possession that would lead me to believe that large-scale depletion is going on. Now again, we typically monitor the areas where groundwater use is higher for irrigation, industrial uses, again, because those are uses that we have some authority over. But as far as I am aware, large-scale groundwater declines in Seward County at least haven't been reported to me. Let's put it that way.
But even in Nebraska now, we got Auburn, we got Peru, we got Bennett, Nebraska City. These places are running out of water. They're going to go from Missouri to tap in. Isn't that going to happen here eventually?
There's that possibility, you know. I have the same crystal ball that you do, you know.
We don't have a Missouri right here.
Right.
You want us to go out to Ranch Oak and suck water out of that?
I wouldn't go that far. Yeah, yeah, back there.
So what do? If you got someone that wants to put a irrigation well somewhere where everybody knows that it shouldn't be, what are your options? What do you do to make that not happen or whatever?
Again, if it was an irrigation well
pumping more than 50 gallons a minute, it would have to get a permit from the NRD, okay? And depending upon the situation, we may require aquifer testing, and based upon that aquifer testing, then we'd make the decisions whether or not we want to issue the permit. You know, individual neighbors, landowners who might be opposed to a certain use or certain installation, that's not a new situation. Every NRD all across the state has dealt with those sorts of things. Okay? To start with, communicating your concerns to the NRD is a good place to start, and we can sit down and talk about what the situation is and try and gain more information. It's not such a situation if somebody calls up and says, I'm opposed to this well going in, we say, stop. That's not how it works.
But you guys don't even inform people that irrigation wells coming in. Why can't you talk to the neighbors?
It depends on where that is and how much is pumping. Yeah, typically we don't. If they meet our permit requirements, we issue the permit. And again, the permit requirements do take into account how much water is being pumped and where it's coming from. So, Jack?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, Dick. What is the aquifer, the static showing in your latest data, since we're in this dry cycle, if you will? Second question is, the development that's taking place in in Lancaster County, how is that affecting us here since we're coming out of the same aquifer? Obviously, if their aquifer is deeper than us, we're going to run out of water first. And the third question is that the county developed its standards based upon Conservation Survey's document about Seward County. And that's why it is what it is. It isn't that we sat around and flipped a coin.
First question, what our groundwater monitoring data is showing about water levels, as you would expect, the last 2-3 years have been pretty dry. We measure about 150 wells throughout our district. Our district covers about 1 million acres. And again, they're in several different aquifer units. Basically, those levels have been anywhere from up a few feet, and that's mostly like in the Missouri River, where the groundwater levels are doing whatever the river's doing. Pretty much the same thing in the Platte River Valley. You get up out of those river valleys, groundwater levels are down anywhere from a few inches to a few feet over the last few years. Now again, how good is that? How bad is that? It depends upon circumstances. There are parts of our district where the aquifer is 150 foot thick in good sand and gravel. If you're losing 6 inches out of that over 3 years, that's one thing. If you've got another aquifer unit where it's maybe only 30 feet thick and you've lost 3 feet out of that, that's an entirely different situation. But generally speaking, due to the ongoing dry conditions, yeah, our water levels are down. As far as western Lancaster County, again, we haven't seen any declines other than those kinds of numbers, few inches to a few feet over the last few years. So.
I mean, frankly, I'm surprised they're not pumping more salt water simply because their freshwater level is so thin. I really am.
Yeah. Well, and that's why, you know, we're encouraging private well owners to have their well tested on a fairly frequent basis for things like sodium, chloride, PDS. We have had some indications over time, particularly in southern Lancaster County, is one farmer I know of, he's passed away now, but he was tracking it quite over a long time, and he said he could see the salinity in his soils going up, and his yields were going the other way, so it's going like this. Okay.
He was irrigating?
Yeah, it was a center pivot, pumping several 100-gallon minutes. So basically, he worked to actually make his well shallower. So.
And the last question, if I may, is to figure out the recharge of the aquifer. I mean, I've asked this question before, and the answer is well, it just kind of comes a little bit from everywhere.
Yeah, and Katie has done more of that work than I have. I'm not going to throw her under the bus too much, but I feel very confident in saying that figuring out recharge rates and sources is one of the most complicated and difficult tasks in groundwater geology. simply because of what you said. If you've got an aquifer that's down here, well, there's a certain amount of water that's coming down from directly over it. But if it's mostly silt and clay above that aquifer, it's probably not very much. So if that's the case, then you've got water coming in laterally. But then you've got to know where that water's coming from and go mapping long distances to the lateral.
Is that, when you go laterally, are you heading towards Colorado? Is that where you're heading with that?
It depends on where you're at. Most of the subsurface flow that we find here, we think we're stealing water from Upper Big Blue in some cases. South or northeast, northwest to southeast. And again, the third possibility is induced
Is there
upwelling.
any connection between the high plains and the Dakota?
Not in this part of the world, no. And I suppose on the edge, Katie, you're more familiar with that.
We're
further west.
finding more and more with the survey work that we have to lump things in where they're screened. So like, we gotta treat all the Dakota ones together, treat all the high plains together, you know, treat all the alluvial, you know, river, near the river aquifers as their own, map them almost separately with the water levels, because the Dakota is heavily confined here too, so.
As I recall, in northeast Nebraska, there's some of those ratty outliers in
Yes.
Dakota that might
Yes.
be laying directly on top, or
Up by
the
South
Ogallala that might be lying directly on the Dakota, but not in our district, at least not that I'm aware of, because I don't think we have any high plains aquifer in our district. Yeah.
You mentioned that over the last couple of years, the levels are down. If you extended that out to, say, 25 years, would you say the same thing?
Really good question. We have several wells that have been monitored for upwards of 40 years. And in most cases, even though there is somewhat of a decline, if you run a regression curve, again, we're still looking at declines or changes over time in the area a few inches to a few feet, sometimes a little bit up, sometimes a little bit down. Now again, that depends on where you're at. If you're up in the northwestern part of our district where the aquifer is highly confined, it responds to changes in pressure. So when the guys up there kick on their irrigation well, I can sit in my office and I can look at some remote instrumentation that shows that in a matter of a few days, water levels in those wells drop 120 feet. Yeah, that kind of, so, but that's the way that aquifer has always been. And then when everybody shuts off in September, water levels come right out. So that's one of the places, the only place we have in our district where we're restricting the amount of water that can be in the water. So, yeah.
You said that Seward County was one of the only counties in Nebraska that has a conservative.
That I'm aware of, yeah.
And Lancaster County doesn't really care one iota of how many people are putting acreages in. Am I kind of correct on that?
I guess I would disagree somewhat, simply because I've had to go over and talk to the Planning Commission a few times about new developments and possible groundwater concerns. I think people got more excited about things like chicken farms and feedlots, but I have been involved in some acreage developments where it's been a similar thing. So, it's kind of hard to say what you prefer there, but the Planning Commission in Lancaster County does get those things before them fairly frequently. I think he's got one.
The other part is Texas and Oklahoma and parts of Kansas and everything, like New Mexico, I've heard, have talked about tapping into the Oklahoma aquifer and pumping water down that way, which I don't know if that's a possibility, but.
Well, you got enough money, about anything's possible.
Yeah, but
no, actually, the Ogallala, the High Plains aquifer extends all the way down into Texas. And in places like western Kansas, western Oklahoma, central and western Texas, they have drawn water levels down enough there that basically a lot of farmers are drying up their ground. They just can't afford to pump the water from that deep if there's any water left. Now, again, water law in those states is much different than it is in Nebraska. Even though Nebraska's water management has its faults, Boy, I wouldn't trade our system for anyone in the western United States, because up until recently, a lot of the western United States, basically, if you own the ground, you own the water underneath it, so you can put a well in and pump as much as you want. If it dries up your neighbor, that's just tough toenails. That water is yours. That's not the way Nebraska water law works. But I'm not a lawyer, that's not as much as I know.
Lancaster County has a 20-acre minimum limit for acreages, which is equivalent to Seward County's R1 zoning for their entire county. And we are the only county with a water conservation district.
Yeah, back to what Jack kind of touched on this. You know, back in '97, when we first started having all these meetings to do this conservation district, you know, we set the rules. You can only have so many gallons a minute on a new well. You can only have so many PSI in a new well. And our county has not been enforcing it. When you drive by a newer house and you see sprinklers out there and they're going, we know that they're not following the 4 gallon a minute rule. Things like that. So, not Lancaster County, Seward County, we're doing it to ourselves. If that's what we're gonna happen, we need to either change something, enforce it, you know. I don't have sprinklers. My well's over 100 years old. We conserve water all the time. We have 2 houses, plus all my cattle in 1 well. And we watch what we do with our water. Our lawn goes brown in the summer. That's what we're gonna have to face.
It's not the only place in the country that's facing it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and to his point though, is wouldn't you have to be facing that together as a state, and not just as a county? Because if the Dakota is running under all these other counties that don't have water conservation efforts or rules, and you're telling us that there's this lateral movement that happens throughout the area, then what's the point? You know, Saline and you know, all these surrounding counties, Lancaster, aren't they just going to be drawing water out from under us no matter what we do?
That sort of thing is a possibility, but I will say that the evolution of the natural resources district system over the past 50 years, we've come a long ways. We got a long ways to go, but pretty much every NRD, all 23 districts in the state, are actively managing groundwater withdrawals. Some of them have tighter restrictions, some of them have lesser restrictions, but they're all actively managing that. And particularly where you have aquifer units in common. I mean, if you talk about the Ogallala or High Plains aquifer, that's the western 3/4 of the state, you know, and it's kind of hard to get your arms around that. But yeah, if you go up to the NRD out of Wahoo, Lower Platte North, they have some of the same issues with saline water intrusion out of the Dakota that we do. And they're trying to get their arms around that. So I know that's a pretty nebulous answer, but we're making progress in it. Not fast enough, not, you know, but we're making progress.
Thank you. And if I could add just one quick question too.
Sure.
Is if this area would dry up, are there any long-range plans for how we would maybe pull water over from the Ogallala? That would be the closest source, obviously.
Well, it depends on how much water you're talking about. There are other sources, but obviously the biggest source is the Ogallala or the High Plains. As of current statute right now, if new rural water systems are developed, natural resources districts are responsible for developing those. That is a long-term issue. It's something that requires a lot of study, a lot of upfront work, and a lot of money. Okay. So if an area is very water short, that is one possible solution. Now I know in our district, the eastern part of the district, groundwater is almost non-existent in some places. They have had rural water districts over there since the 1970s, or even before, since before the NRDs actually existed. So many places like in Cass County, Odo County, those areas, they are served by rural water. But again, there's problems, no, I wouldn't say problems, but there's issues with that. Again, it's expensive. You gotta pay for the water just like you're living in town. And some of their rates, since they're moving it over a long distance, some of those rates can be, you know, not cheap. So that is one possibility. Yeah.
So Dick, what do you think about, I know this is a reach, you know, the governor's kind of changed his methodology of how the agency I work for, and the combining now of our agency with another agency to look at water quality, water quantity. Do you think that there'll be more discussion as we move forward on the evaluation of some of the aquifers?
Well, I would certainly hope so, but trying to predict what the next governor or congressional delegation is going to do or think, you know,
I just don't know.
I've had less hazardous occupations in my life, let's put it that way.
You know, we're in the progression of trying to set the foreground, and I feel like he's got some sort of a plan. That,
Yeah.
you know, how long it'll last, I don't know.
I do think that, you know, Nebraska relying on groundwater for a large portion of its agricultural base, everybody's pretty well aware of the importance of groundwater. So, you know, there may be more emphasis or less emphasis, but I have a hard time imagining any administration just saying, ah, the heck with it, let's not worry about it. So, but that's about as far as I can go, Mark, or as far as I'm willing to go.
I had to throw it out there.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Yeah.
You're the same boys out there.
Well, folks, it's 20 after 8. Scott, like I said, I'm willing to stay around as long as people want to talk. I've just got to go back to Lincoln, so it's not a big deal. Before you leave, I do have some of my business cards. If you want to take one, feel free to. I think you probably